Welcome to Did You Know Basel, the podcast series developed by Space Basel that takes you to some known and unknown places in our city. My name is Christoph van Houten, and today I am joined by Tim Buser. Tim is a PhD candidate in history here at the University of Basel, and he's doing research about soldier identities, better, mercenary identities. This is a project about Swiss soldiers in the early phase of European colonialism. So, hello, Tim, and welcome. Now, Tim, everybody knows the Swiss guards, the Swiss soldiers that protect the Vatican. Now, for the rest, I think most people know very little about Switzerland's take on soldierly issues, except it being the most military neutral country in the world. Now, your research is about Swiss soldiers, more specifically about the mercenaries in the 17th and the 18th century in the colonies, not the Swiss colonies, but colonies of other countries. And interestingly, the stories of some of these soldiers can tell us a bit more about Basel itself. So, Tim, where are you, or better, where are they taking us today? Where in Basel do we start?
Hi, Christoph. Thank you so much for having me. I am taking you for a walk down Freie Straße. We start at the top end of the street and we'll go further down. And there we have three stops and look at different buildings that have something to do with colonial mercenaries from Basel in that early modern period of the 17th and 18th century. So the first stop is at the top end of the street, and we are at the Dreizackbrunnen, that fountain in the street. From there, we look towards Barfüßerplatz and look at houses, and nowadays we see shops there like New Yorker or Kos, but historically we would look at the premises of the hospital with various buildings and a chapel that spanned over 2 blocks there at the top end of Freie Straße. So we look at the hospital because that was the place where one Basel surgeon used to work in that 17th century, who has previously traveled to West Africa in Dutch service. His name was Samuel Brun. And as a barber surgeon, he worked on Dutch ships for 11 years. He did so after migrating through Germany and the Netherlands as part of his practical education. The moment where he arrived in Amsterdam is described very beautifully in his travelogue. He wrote that travelogue once he got back to Basel in 1624. And I will read just that little section from his travelogue. He says, "There, to my great astonishment, I saw all manner of large ships sailing in and out from every corner of the world, such as the East Indies, the West Indies, Guinea, Angola, Levanto, Portugal, Spain, Italy, and so on. This made me eager to explore such new and wondrous lands and kingdoms, so that they might serve as a pleasant memory for me and others." So he describes Amsterdam as a place which was sort of the gate towards the world. This had to do with the fact that Amsterdam and the Netherlands were at that period pretty much the center of the world, and it was a big trading hub. The Dutch controlled the spice trade from the East Indies and also traded with the West Indies. So the East Indies is what we would call Asia today, and the West Indies is what we call America today. So in total, he made 5 different ship voyages to different places in the Mediterranean and the West African coast, to countries that are today Congo and Ghana.
So, how did Samuel Brun end up after these trips to Western Africa, back to Basel, to the Freie Strasse and the hospital?
Well, he ended up here, first of all, I think because he was very lucky, since if we look at the numbers, 2/3 of those who entered service for the Dutch East India Company didn't make it back home. 2/3 of them died. Some of them stayed and started a new life in the colonies, but those are few. Most of them died of diseases on the ships or at war. There were many ways to die there, so it was quite risky. And he was lucky to make it back home. And he also made it back home to Basel as a very experienced and also wealthy man. So he became surgeon in the hospital at the top end of Freie Straße. And he also bought a house which was right across the street, also in the Freie Straße, which is building number 93 that exists today and houses the Cinemood shop, which you might be familiar with. So he lived there, worked in the hospital there, and he was also a member of the guild Zum Goldenen Sternen, which is a house. The guild's house is not there anymore in Freie Straße, but it is at that place where today you have the Pfauen department store. So he was in that very narrow circle of these three different buildings where he worked and lived once he got back in the middle of the 17th century. And he wrote a travelogue that he published, from which I quoted before. He published it in 1624 after his return, and these are proofs of his global connections that already were there in the 17th century. And his travelogue also allows to show how a local institution like the hospital um, and the Surgeons Guild were globally connected due to a surgeon who got a lot of his experience and practice from his service on Dutch ships and in the colonies at the West African coast. So he also made experiences there treating tropical diseases. And all these skills that he obtained due to his colonial service helped him getting a good position once he got back to Basel and a good social standing. He married, had a lot of children, and had a good life once he got back to Basel, thanks to his colonial service for the Dutch. So we moved down Freie Straße to another place, building number 35 in Freie Straße. It's a department store as well. I think at the moment it is empty and under construction, but it has been a department store for centuries already. It used to be called Magazine zum Wilden Mann, and this name comes back from a tavern that has been at this place since the medieval ages. It has nothing to do with Klein Basel's Vogel Grief and Wildemann and Loy. It was the name of that guest house that was there.
So how does this Wildemann relate to colonial?
This guest house zum Wilden Mann is the setting of a meeting that took place in 1669. This meeting was the occasion where the fate of a Basel mercenary in the Dutch East Indies, in what is today Indonesia, was discussed. So, in that guest house, people came together, two relatives of Daniel Thierry and a pharmacist from Bern. That pharmacist from Bern has been to the Dutch East Indies as well at that period where Daniel Thierry was there. So he tells those relatives as an eyewitness of what he has seen in the Dutch East Indies and about Daniel Thierry's fate. There was a notary present as well. He is the one who wrote all these things down, and the document that he wrote is still preserved in the State's archives of Basel, and that is the reason why we know this story today. So the Bernese pharmacist tells the relatives of Daniel Thierry that he had met Daniel Thierry 5 years ago when they were both in Batavia, which is today Jakarta, the capital of Indonesia. There, Daniel Thierry has been working as a goldsmith, but from time to time, when necessary, he also carried out his military duties for the Dutch since he was in their service as a mercenary. So one day, he and three other soldiers were commanded to Sumatra, the neighboring island. Before going there, he maybe had assumed that he might die there at war. He had written a testament and made a good friend of his sole heir. And so only 30 of those 300 men who went to war on Sumatra returned back to Batavia. The rest, including Thierry, were, as the Bernese tells us in the document, they were driven into a swamp on Sumatra, cut down and killed. Later, the witness from Bern saw that the aforementioned heir and had indeed taken possession of the goldsmith's tools and Thierry's inheritance. So the Bernese pharmacist confirms to the relatives in Basel that there's no doubt that their relative had died in Batavia and that there was nothing that they could inherit. So this is a story different from the one from Samuel Brun because Daniel Cherry is one of those many Basel mercenaries who didn't make it back home because they died. And we know this only by coincidence since that document has been preserved. And still, it shows a very important part that not all those who traveled abroad made it back home, but they had hopes for a better life there, and many of those hopes were not fulfilled.
Well, thank you. Although a sad story, I know that there is even a third house in the Freie Strasse that has a connection to this period and to the Basel's mercenaries. Can you tell us this story as well?
Yes, Christoph, there is a third house, and it's right next to that guest house, which is today that department store zum Wilden Mann. It is the Guild's house, the Schlüsselzunft. Many know it probably as the restaurant that it is, but it also is still today the Guild's house. And it has been already in the 18th century, and this is the period where I'm taking you for the last mercenary. It's the story of Daniel Frischmann. He was a trained merchant, and that is why he was part of that Schlüsselzunft, of that guild. But he didn't work as a merchant, but left Basel at a young age and migrated, as Samuel Brun did as well, to the Netherlands. And there he enlisted as a cadet in a Swiss battalion of the British East India Company. So not the Dutch, but the British. And he came to Madras, which is nowadays Chennai at the eastern coast of India. There he had a adventurous time there in his military service, and he was also for several times taken prisoner of war by the French. And then there was the 7-Year War from 1756 to 1763. And in that period, I think that was where he managed to move up the ranks. And moving up the military ranks was, especially in the British East India Company, a good possibility to obtain the possibility to trade privately as well. So after 18 years in India in 1770, he came back to Basel as a very wealthy man. He enriched himself thanks to the private trade that he was able to do very successfully. And once back in Basel, he lived from managing the wealth that he had amassed, and he kept amassing by trading contacts that he had maintained. He became an office holder in the Schlüssel Guilds, in the Schlüsselzunft, that building that we are looking at, and he even became member of Basel's government before he died in 1808. So he is another example of a very successful mercenary, which is very not representative. Stories like Daniel Cherry, who are harder to know of, but they were much more common. But in his case, it also shows us that guilds like the merchant guild zum Schlüssel were globally or colonially connected. And that is part of the reason why Basel became a very wealthy city due to the trade connections. So looking at the Schlüsselzunft or the former guest house zum Wilden Mann or the hospital at the top end of the Freie Straße, we see places that are maybe at second glance only connected to colonial history, and that is not often thought of when we think of Swiss history or of Swiss mercenaries. Christoph, as you said before, the Swiss mercenaries are often only known when we think of the Swiss guards in the Vatican, or maybe as soldiers Swiss regiments who fought in European wars in the medieval ages, but there were also mercenaries who worked or served in the colonies of other European countries. And these were 3 examples that can be connected to Freie Straße that I tried to show you today.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Tim, for these extremely interesting tales. And ever since you told me them, the stories of Samuel Brun, of Daniel Thierry, of Daniel Frischmann, I cannot not think of these people and their histories when I walk in Freie Strasse and imagine how things must have been in that time. And this is what history should do. It should make us think about the past and imagine things how they were in the past. So thank you so much for listening. And thank you also to our listeners for listening to the second episode of Space Basel's podcast series on the city of Basel. Thank you so much.